Thank you. It's good to be with all of you. What we want to talk about is the movement to a digital economy for the private markets, and what are the elements that we need to achieve an outcome. And what we're talking about specifically, where there's significant value, is where there is data that can be relied upon by third parties, where there is a provenance to the data as it relates to private assets. And one of the reasons public assets perform so well is A, there's a lot of trading, but B, that trading is predicated upon data that is understood, it's readily available, and it's trusted. So how are we going to move to a digital economy for private assets in the future? It is fundamentally predicated upon data that you can understand, see, and trust. And that's what we're going to focus on, and that's what Inveniam Capital Partners is going to focus on. And you know, we're really focused on coming together and providing for these private markets a set of tools that can provide data that the whole world can see, but also that we can control. And I want to go back and talk for a minute about this world where everybody started to get free software tools in the early 2000s, right? LinkedIn started in 2002, 2004. We got Gmail. We have Facebook in 2004. Android in 2008. We're getting all of these great free things. Isn't this great? It's all wonderful. And little did we know that we gave 100% of our data to other people, and we no longer owned our own data, right? We had given up our data in the trade, not knowing what the other side of the trade was. We believe the world of the future is one where individuals and businesses own their own data, and they choose how to relate that data to other data sets and other tools that allow them to price the assets that they own, but the data that they are creating on their own assets, in fact, have been notarized on the blockchain, indexed so that they're searchable, and then verified against other assets or other data sets so that you know that those what they're stating is in range for what you ought to expect. Does that make sense? So we're going to a world where there are going to be millions of data creators and hundreds, maybe thousands of data validators, but where everybody owns their own data in a data ecosystem, moving beyond databases. And Inveniam, we're really at the corner of capital markets, blockchain, and big data, where we're going to try and bring to private assets public market performance, right? And we'll really talk about that. And I'm not going to talk too much about what Inveniam's going to do, but I really want to talk about the markets themselves, right? And I'm going to start with G.K. Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton wrote this book called What's Wrong with the World. And in that book, What's Wrong with the World, he talks about everybody looking at the same symptoms and coming up with different solutions, right, in politics. And part of the problem is nobody has the internal fortitude to say what the precondition is, which is a vision of health for what the body politic ought to look like. You know what I mean? So if you don't take that position. Today, in blockchain and capital markets and private assets, we have a lot of people who are really having a hard time articulating the problem that the blockchain is solving. And I'm saying the problem is even bigger than that. There's really a hard time envisioning what the capital markets for private assets are going to look like in 10 years. And what I want to do is start with a basic set of assumptions on what the capital markets are going to look like if they're going to exist digitally, right? And so what is a digital capital market function, right? It's where we can have a conversation back and forth or a discourse that is logically based, where we can do transactions back and forth, where there are bid and asks, where there's assumed sets of data that we understand and we know who our counterparty is. How do we do that? And I say, let's go all the way back to the basic principles of a logical discussion, right? And I'm not saying anything new. Plato talked about this, right? That there's three laws, right? A principle of non-contradiction, a principle of identity, and a principle of the excluded middle when you have a logical discourse, right? There's a digital principle for each one of those. Satoshi solved a digital principle of non-contradiction, meaning you can't do a double spend. There's a ton of people doing reg tech and ID tech, which is a digital principle of identity, meaning who's my third party. Inveniam is focused on the digital principle of the excluded middle, which is what is the data Can I rely on the data, assume a certain set of assumed facts, and an agreement of what happens if this happens or that happens? And people talk to us all the time, what is the base operating system of Inveniam? And our base operating system, we say, is the Chancery Court of the state of Delaware, right? We are built on the existing systems where we have recourse to the law, but what we're doing is we are creating digital financial instruments. We don't like to use tokenization for a lot of different reasons. And so what is that? It's a digital proof of ownership, right? It is this new century's form of certification attached to the event series. All of the legal, financial, diligence, and performance data, not only of the financial instrument, but of the underlying asset. So literally, we take all the IoT data, energy utilization data, performance data, key fob data, footfall traffic, financial performance data, and we notarize it, index it, field it, validate it, and then that can start going into things like pricing models, right? And pricing models, the reason this is grayed out is because we do this in partnership in an open architecture where we invite anybody to come onto our platform and create their own pricing model. And you can choose, do I want to use the Jones Lang LaSalle pricing model for my commercial office building? Do I want to use the Cushman & Wakefield? Do I want to use the CBRE? And right now, we're focused on commercial real estate. Today, if I want to, and we talked about this in yesterday's panel, if I want to buy and sell a building in London, right? You're going to give me the data. It's going to take me 9 weeks to do due diligence. And then if I want to flip it, the buyer is going to take another 9 weeks. We're going to come to a point in the next few years where literally I'm going to be able to buy a building in London and flip out of it within the same 24-hour period of time. The only way I'm going to do that is if I and the other buyer have a set of facts that we rely upon, that we both agree upon, and we can understand that building's performance in relation to other assets around it, if that makes sense. And so that's what we're doing, right? And so that's what we're doing. And what is the blockchain in this asset? And we say the blockchain is a secondary form of data retention. And some blockchain people who I tell this to get really upset about that. But there is no way any real company in the world today is going to use the blockchain as its primary source of data retention. They just aren't, right? But by the way, that's not what the blockchain was designed for. The blockchain was designed as kind of a triple ledger entry system, right? As a mechanism to commute trust in a trustless environment. If I have all my own data, but as I maintain my data on a short interval audit period, meaning daily, weekly, monthly, I'm collecting data. I'm notarizing it as it's being generated. I'm indexing it so it's searchable, and I'm validating it all the time against other like assets. My data with what's on the blockchain, my performance data builds trust and it seasons. Does that make sense? I'm seasoning the data as I do it, and it has the ability to commute the trust from one data owner to the next data owner. And that's all it's doing, but the data is residing somewhere else. And when we're talking, we have several Fortune 1000 companies that are implementing our software right now in Q1, where we're able to do this, where we're taking an office building, we're going all the way through, and we're going to be able to provide monthly pricing and then weekly pricing on their net asset value of the performance of their office building using our software. Why does that matter for them, right? Well, number one, from an accounting perspective, it takes, when FASB 157 or ASC 820, it takes it from a level 3 asset, which is an illiquid asset, to a level 2 asset, a marketable alternative. Level 1 is a fully liquid asset. What does that do? That changes their capital at risk calculation, that changes their mark to markets, that changes their tier 1 capital calculation. That is massively important for any Basel III signatory, any too big to fail bank holding company, somebody like that. And for us coming in saying, we're going to have your data, where 100% of your data is ready for sale every day of the week. Not when I'm ready to sell my building, I go hire an investment banker and they put together a book and then they go market it, and you hire them partially to put the data together, but partially to validate your own data. That you're not going to need that anymore. You're still going to need them to market and distribute it and find the right buyers, right? But when you maintain all of your data every day ready for sale, and you have a weekly price on that asset, the data is better than public market data, right? And the pricing is weekly. it feels a lot like a public asset, and we think that illiquidity premium that you pay on real estate assets, the delta between what family offices demand to invest in a real estate deal versus what a REIT generates on its equity, there's going to be massive compression between that in efficiencies in the marketplace. But the first place that it's going to be felt is on the balance sheet of large corporations who use this. But in this, we are not in there selling blockchain. We are selling, we can change how you mark an asset to your books, because the data has provenance behind it. It's the supply chain of the data that leads into a pricing model that can be publicly seen and recalculated weekly. Does that make sense? So that's what we're doing. And what we're doing is we take this in order to provide an ROI. And we use an example all the time of the difference between the commercial real estate market and the CMBS market, or commercial mortgage-backed securities market, or the residential mortgage-backed securities market, RMBS, and homes. And if you look at and you compare those two things, what's more liquid? Are the mortgages more liquid, or the underlying assets more liquid? The mortgages are way more liquid, right? They trade all the time in the marketplace. Why? Because there's a set of data that people can see, and they can constrain their view to that performance data, and it's easy to trade, and it's a form that people understand the data and they can rely on it. You don't have that data on a granular basis or around the underlying asset. Where does that lead to a problem? When there's a dislocation between the performance of the paper or the piece of the capital stack and the underlying asset. That will never happen again if the data from the underlying asset is directly connected to the digital proof of ownership. Does that make sense? That digital financial instrument literally has embedded in it the performance data of the underlying asset. And that is what we're moving towards, right? And what we want to do is talk about a world where we notarize on the blockchain, the data sits in a repository behind AWS, all the data becomes fielded, and it gets validated, right? And blockchain we use as data librarian and notary. We use big data and artificial intelligence to validate against like assets. And more of these things, as they're built, we'll be able to compare a medical office building against a medical office building. And as we get more medical office buildings, we'll understand performance of one versus the other, and relative value becomes much clearer. Does that make sense? And this digital twin that is created for that physical asset, we're all operational, so maintenance, right? When you put a new elbow joint, in the plumbing, or you change out the filters in the HVAC, all of that's held in what are typically today called building information management systems are going to be notarized and indexed. And you're going to understand what is this building's maintenance schedule as compared relative to other buildings' maintenance schedules. What is their investment into the building? What is the return on the building? And what you're going to see is big data. But that only happens in a world where people who own their own data decide how they're going to validate it. And if they want buyers and they want liquidity, they're going to have to validate and have their information in relationship to other, but it's their choice. And we do this on a SaaS platform. And we call this our one chart to rule them all, right? So excuse me for the really busy chart, right? But you understand kind of office building where we have CRE partners who help with implementation, where we can say for a smart building, right now if I own Rockefeller Center, there is no economic incentive for me to make that building smart. For a new building, we build them smart all the time, right? But if for Rockefeller Center, I've got stability, I've got location in New York City, right on 52nd and 5th, right? It's a fabulous asset. And I've got stable tenants. The only reason that I would make, an investment of $5 to $10 million to make that building smart is so somebody in New Jersey can control the air conditioning, right? Not a good value proposition. But if we can say, the moment your building becomes smart, we can begin repricing it, correlating it to other assets that are similar, and you as public company that hold that asset, you can now carry that as a level 2 asset, which means you free up dramatically the liquidity discount that you hold it on your balance sheet, and you change your capital at risk. Man, that is an incentive to make buildings smart now. So we have lots of smart building companies partnering up with us to implement this, because there's now a value chain for them to implement their data, right? So we take it, we notarize it, we index it, we validate it, against our CRE partners' data pools as it relates to like assets. So we're beginning on commercial real estate. We have the largest commercial real estate manager in the world acting as our partner, and we have a data set of 6,000 commercial office buildings around the world that we can validate against their performance. And then we go into a pricing model where we have to correlate the asset to the pricing model, and we can report it up, and it can be out there in the market. And I'm not going to talk too much about that, but what you get here is real-time NAV pricing that's monthly and then weekly, and eventually we want to get to daily, but for daily pricing you need to have daily data inputs, and the reality is we can't collect data inputs, right? And what would change that would change the asset value of a building on a monthly or weekly basis? It's not the building's performance, it's the bond market, right, for the cap rates, and or comparable sales in the economy, or unemployment in that MSA or that metropolitan statistical area. So what we see is an ability where we're going to have this, and we're going to start to provide this and really impact people's balance sheets. And where I want to go with this is that we really see a vision of a digital future for data-rich, low-frequency trading assets where people hold things like private credit and private assets on their balance sheet, and they're not going to resell them, but they need to reprice them all the time. And especially for public companies that have non-core real estate on their balance sheet, that is typically, for large public companies, not valued at all. This is a mechanism for them to identify unique value on building by buildings basis and have that value unearthed on their balance sheet pretty dramatically. So this is what we're doing. It is a use case that matters today, and we think the real future is, with just a last thought, the future of the world is on lots of different proof of work blockchains. What do you have? You have a calculation that is a wasted piece of energy. It is a wasted calculation. We think proof of work in the future of blockchain is going to be a pricing algorithm, where somebody who's going to crunch a transaction that is proof of work is actually going to be valuing another asset. So effectively, the work calculation on an anonymized basis is really going to be something where, as a proof of work function occurs, literally it will be repricing somebody else's asset. So instead of paying to get something valued by a third party, an appraiser, you're going to be paying as a form of incentivizing proof of work. Does that make sense? We think that's a vision of the future for private markets. And sorry I went long. Am I done? Perfect.
Thank you, Pat.